What would you do if at just 26 the world buried your husband, stole your home, and left you wandering the frozen wilderness with nothing but a quilt and fading hope? Would you surrender to the storm's icy grip? Or dare to believe that somewhere in the darkness a stranger's voice might call you back to life? This is the story the West tried to erase, but could not. The last of the mourners had left 3 days ago, and the small cabin that once held laughter now echoed with silence. Margaret Thornton stood at its threshold, 26 years old and already a widow, her black dress clinging to her thin frame as November winds clawed through the broken seams of the walls. The Wyoming wilderness pressed in from every side, vast and pitiless, but the cold within her chest was far crueler than the one outside. Her husband Thomas had been gone scarcely a month, swallowed whole by a mine collapse that claimed 3 lives and shattered countless others. The company offered condolences, hollow as wind, but no coin for bread, no roof to shield a grieving woman from the storm of survival. And then came the letter. Words scrawled by Thomas's brother, hard as iron, final as a gunshot. The cabin belongs to the Thornton family. You have no claim here. Find somewhere else to go. No mercy, no hesitation, no kinship, only banishment. She remembered their disapproval even on her wedding day. No dowry, no family name, nothing but love. And now, stripped of Thomas, they cast her out as if she were nothing but a beggar at their door. So she packed her world into a single carpet bag. 2 dresses worn thin by years of washing, her mother's Bible, and a silver thimble. Her grandmother's quilt, faded but warm, a photograph of her and Thomas smiling against a summer sky. She touched each item as if it were bone and blood, fragments of a life stolen too soon. She closed the door slowly, her hand trembling against the wood her husband had cut and shaped with his own hands. The stove where she had cooked their meals, the window where she had watched for his return, the bed they had built together, all of it was now denied her. With one final push, she sealed it shut, and it felt like burying her life a second time. Bitter Creek lay behind her, only 2 miles, yet farther than the moon. She had already walked those streets, begged at the boarding house, the general store, even the saloon, but each place gave her the same answer: we're not hiring. Whispers trailed her wherever she went. Widow Thornton, pity in some voices, blame in others, none willing to offer a hand. So she walked west, away from the town, away from the whispers, the earth beneath her boots, frozen and cruel. The sky darkened with clouds heavy as iron, and the road stretched like a wound into the horizon. By afternoon, the air sharpened, cutting through her thin dress, the storm rising in the distance like a predator waiting to strike, and Margaret knew the world had turned its back on her, and night was coming fast. The storm gathered as if heaven itself wished to erase her from the earth. Margaret pressed forward, clutching her carpet bag, her boots slick with mud that froze before her eyes. Each step was punishment, the bag growing heavier, the wind slicing through her like blades. She tried a farmhouse on the road, knocking with trembling hands. A stern-faced woman answered, her eyes hard as flint. My husband wouldn't like it, she said curtly before closing the door. The word propriety lingered in Margaret's mind like an accusation. What use was propriety when hunger gnawed her belly and frost stole the breath from her lungs? At the next homestead, an old man whittled wood on the porch, his knife scraping with each cut. His smile was wrong, too wide, too knowing. I might have work, he said slowly, eyes crawling over her. Pretty thing, like you could keep me company on long winter nights. His laughter chased her into the road, shame and fear pounding in her chest. By dusk, the storm broke its chains. Snow fell first in soft flakes, then in a furious wall of white, blotting out sky and earth until the world became nothing but gray void. The wind howled, drowning thought, tearing at her shawl, her gloves stiff with ice. Her lips cracked and bled, her lashes froze into needles. She forced one foot ahead of the other, knowing that to stop was to surrender to death. She thought of Thomas, tried to remember the warmth of his smile, but even memory turned brittle in the storm's grasp. Then hope, a shadow through the blizzard. A barn. She stumbled forward, only to collapse against its broken walls, the roof long caved in, nothing left but ruin. Despair sank its claws into her chest. She fell to her knees, whispering into the snow, "I'm sorry, Thomas. Sorry she hadn't been stronger. Sorry she hadn't found a way to live without him." Her body shook violently, then strangely eased, calm washing over her. She knew what it meant. The final surrender. Somewhere in the howling void came the echo of hoofbeats, or was it only the wind? The ground shivered faintly beneath her, and before she could lift her head, darkness swept in. The last thing she felt was warmth, unnatural, sudden, as though death itself had been pushed aside. A voice thundered through the storm, "Hold on, just hold on." When she opened her eyes again, she was wrapped in blankets, heavy and warm. Firelight flickered across thick log walls, the scent of wood smoke and coffee filling her lungs. She was not dead. She was alive. A man moved near the stove, tall and broad-shouldered. His sleeves rolled as he stirred a pot. His dark hair bore strands of silver, his face marked by years of toil, though he looked no older than 35. His gray eyes, sharp and steady, turned toward her. "You're awake?" he said quietly. "Wasn't sure you'd make it." Panic seized her alone in a stranger's cabin, every possession of hers piled neatly near the door, yet nothing was missing, nothing touched but her boots drying by the fire. He poured water and held it out, not demanding, only offering. "Name's Daniel Morrison," he said. "Circle M Ranch. Found you half buried in the snow 2 miles south. You've been out nearly a full day. Storm still raging. No one's going anywhere for a while." Margaret sipped the broth he set before her. Plain beef and vegetables, but it tasted like salvation. "Why did you help me?" she whispered. Morrison shrugged, cleaning his rifle with practiced ease. "Saw your tracks on the ridge. Knew someone was in trouble. Would have done the same for anyone." But she knew better. Not everyone would. She had walked the streets of Bitter Creek and learned how quickly neighbors could turn their backs. "I should go," she said softly. "Go where?" Morrison asked simply. His question pressed against her like the storm outside. Go where? The town had refused her, the farms had rejected her, and the road itself had nearly killed her. Her silence was the only answer. The storm clawed at the walls, snow piling high against the cabin logs, but inside the fire gave off warmth that felt almost foreign after so much cold. Yet unease gnawed at Margaret. She was alive only because of this man, yet she knew nothing of him. "I can work," she blurted, her hands tightening around the bowl. "I can cook, mend, keep the place tidy. I don't want to be a burden." Morrison shook his head. "You're not a servant. You're a guest. Rest. That's all you owe me." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, but it carried a gentleness that nearly broke her. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she swallowed them down. That night, he strung a curtain around the bed to grant her privacy and spread his own blankets by the fire. Through the storm's howl, she listened to his quiet breathing, steady as a drumbeat. For the first time since Thomas's death, she slept without tears. Morning came bright, sunlight piercing frost-glazed windows. Morrison was already at work, mending a harness. Margaret rose, shame twisting in her chest. "I should be going," she said, though her voice trembled. He looked up, gray eyes, steady. "Where will you go? Bitter Creek already turned you away. Carson City's 40 miles west. You plan to walk it in winter?" Her hands twisted in the apron he had lent her. "I'll manage." "The way you managed in that storm?" His words were blunt, not cruel. "You'd be dead if I hadn't found you. I won't send you back out to die." Her pride clashed with desperation. "I can't stay." "People will talk. People always talk," Morrison said simply. "Doesn't mean we have to listen." He paused, studying her face as if weighing her spirit. "There's an old foreman's cabin 100 yards from here. Solid enough. If you clean it out, gives you space, gives you shelter, you can stay there till spring." Relief hit her so hard it nearly buckled her knees. Shelter, dignity, a chance. "I couldn't accept without paying my way." "You can read and write?" Morrison asked. "Yes," my mother insisted. "Then you can keep my account books. Numbers give me a headache." For the first time, the corner of his mouth tugged into a faint smile. Margaret found herself nodding. Until spring. Until spring, he agreed. That afternoon, Morrison showed her to the foreman's cabin. Dust lay thick across the floor, mice scurrying into corners, yet the stove worked, the chimney drew clean. She swept until her arms ached, until the little space felt like it might belong to her. Morrison returned with blankets, food, and even a stack of worn books. When she tried to thank him, he shifted uncomfortably. Don't. You'd have done the same. That evening she joined him for supper in the main house. They ate stew by lamplight, silence settling comfortably between them. At last she asked, "Why live out here alone?" His spoon paused midair. "Solitude suits me. The work keeps me busy. Surely not all of it by yourself. I hire hands for roundup and branding. Rest of the year the herd mostly tends itself." His tone carried weight unspoken. Margaret recognized it instantly, the guarded silence of grief. She had lived inside that silence, too. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Morrison met her gaze. In his eyes, she saw it, loss. The kind that never healed, only dulled. And in that recognition, a thread of understanding stretched between them. Days passed. Margaret mended, cleaned, ordered the cabin until it felt almost whole. She caught herself humming once, broom in hand, startled by the sound. She hadn't made music since Thomas's death. Guilt stabbed at her, but she pressed it down. She was still alive. One morning she asked Morrison to let her help with chores. At first he resisted, then finally handed her a pair of oversized gloves. "They'll keep your hands from blistering." Together they broke ice on the troughs, fed the stock, rode out to check the cattle. Margaret's body ached, but the honest labor brought her peace she hadn't known in months. Morrison didn't coddle, didn't patronize. He worked beside her, as if her place had always been there. That night she cooked stew and fresh bread. Morrison ate slowly, savoring every bite. "Been a long time since anyone cooked here but me," he said softly. "I'd forgotten what it was like." She looked across the lamplight at him, weathered face, strong hands, gray eyes that carried both storms and shelter. For the first time since Thomas's passing, Margaret felt something fragile and terrifying stir inside her, the faint possibility of beginning again. But peace in the West was never a gift freely given. On a bitter Tuesday afternoon, as Margaret mended tack in the barn, the quiet broke beneath the clatter of hooves. 4 riders approached, their laughter sharp and cruel against the cold air. At their head rode Frank Coulter, the storekeeper from Bitter Creek. He dismounted with a smirk that never touched his eyes. "Morrison," he called, voice slick with false friendliness. "Heard you've got company out here." Margaret's blood turned to ice as Morrison stepped from the shadows, placing himself between her and the men. "Widow Thornton, isn't it?" Coulter's tone dripped poison. "Couldn't find charity in town, so you struck a different bargain." His companions snickered, filth hidden in their grins. "The lady works here for her keep," Morrison said evenly. "Nothing more. Is that so?" Coulter's smile widened, malice glinting in his eyes. Margaret felt heat rush to her face. She knew what came next. Gossip, sharp as knives, a storm deadlier than snow. Before Morrison could answer, she stepped out into the yard. Her heart pounded, but her chin lifted. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "I believe you're speaking of me." Coulter bowed mockingly. "Just concern, Mrs. Thornton. When I came to your store seeking work, you showed no concern. Yet now, with honest labor to sustain me, suddenly you do." Her gaze swept across them all. "Tell me plainly, do you resent my survival or the fact I found someone who values it?" one of the younger riders sneered. "Everyone knows what kind of woman lives with a man she ain't married to." "Then everyone knows wrong," Margaret shot back, yanking off her gloves. Her hands were blistered, calloused from weeks of work. She held them high. "These are the hands of labor. I muck stalls, mend harnesses, keep books. I earn my bread. If that offends you, perhaps it's your dignity that is lacking, not mine." Silence followed, broken only by the restless stamping of horses. Morrison's jaw tightened, rifle resting low but ready. "At last," Coulter sneered, spitting into the snow. Careful, widow. A woman's reputation is fragile. Might be hard to find respectable work if folks get the wrong idea. Morrison stepped forward, eyes like steel. Her reputation isn't yours to decide. Get off my land. Tension stretched thin as wire, ready to snap. Margaret's pulse hammered. Certain blood would spill. Then, with a flick of his reins, Coulter turned his horse. This ain't over, he growled. The others followed, their laughter fading into the wind. When quiet returned, Margaret's knees trembled with anger and humiliation. Morrison turned to her, voice low. I'm sorry. She shook her head, steel in her voice. Don't be. They would have found something to say no matter what we did. Let them talk. I'm not leaving. Winter deepened. Together they worked the ranch, side by side, enduring storms and long nights. Slowly, the distance between them shrank. He brought her coffee each dawn. She cooked suppers that filled the house with warmth. They shared fragments of their past, Thomas's laughter, Morrison's silence for the wife and child he had buried. The weight of loss remained, but somehow lighter when carried together. Then, one night in January, the valley vanished beneath a blizzard that howled like wolves. Morrison pulled her into the main house for safety. Snow sealed the doors, the world beyond erased. By lamplight they sat, sewing, mending, speaking softly of the dead who still lingered in their hearts. I'm glad you're here, Morrison said at last, his voice breaking the quiet. Not glad for the storm that brought you, but glad all the same. This ranch hasn't felt alive in years. Margaret's throat tightened. I'm glad, too. You saved my life. And perhaps more than that. Their eyes met across the firelight, and for one fragile heartbeat, she thought he might cross the space between them. But he only rose, added wood to the fire, and said gently, try to sleep. The storm would pass by morning, but something had already shifted within her. The blizzard faded, but danger had only shifted its shape. Weeks later, on a moonless night, the thunder of hooves jolted Margaret from sleep. Voices slurred with whiskey drifted through the walls. When she peered out, torches burned in the yard, their flames bending in the wind. 6 men circled the barn and porch like wolves testing the pen. At their head was Daniels, the youngest of Coulter's crew, his eyes wild with drink and resentment. Come out, Morrison, he bellowed. Time to settle accounts. Morrison stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his silhouette framed against the firelight. Outnumbered 6-1, he stood unshaken. Put down the gun, Daniels sneered, or we burn this place to the ground. Margaret's blood iced. The barn, the foreman's cabin, the very home that had sheltered her, reduced to ash in a single breath. Fury sparked in her chest. She could not hide, not while they threatened the only refuge she had left. Snatching the shotgun from the wall, she burst into the yard, snow whipped around her nightdress, her hair plastered to her face. Raising the weapon high, she fired into the sky. The blast cracked like thunder, echoing across the valley. Next shot goes into a man, she cried, voice shaking but strong. Step back. The mob faltered, torches wavering. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then, from beyond the ridge came the pounding of hooves. 3 riders thundered down the slope, badges glinting in the torchlight. Marshal Samuel Hayes and 2 deputies swept into the yard, rifles leveled. Evening, boys, Hayes called, voice calm as steel. Looks like assault and arson to me. Unless you'd like to spend the winter in irons, I suggest you ride on. The intruders cursed, their bravado crumbling. Daniels spat blood from his split lip, mounting with trembling hands. This ain't over, he snarled. Yes, it is, Hayes replied coldly. Because if harm comes to this ranch, I'll know where to look. The mob scattered, torches dropping into the snow. Silence rushed in behind them, heavy and sudden. Morrison lowered his rifle, turning to Margaret. His face was bloodied from the scuffle, his gray eyes burning. You shouldn't have risked yourself. I couldn't stand by while they tore everything down, she said fiercely, breath clouding in the frozen air. He touched her arm gently, his rough hand trembling with something unspoken. What you did tonight, braver than anything I've seen. Something passed between them then. stronger than fear, deeper than gratitude. Winter dragged on, but the night of torches had carved a new truth between them. Margaret no longer felt like a guest. She was a partner, bound not by words but by the firelight of shared danger. Each dawn, Morrison brought her coffee with a quiet nod. Each evening she answered with supper that filled the house with scents of bread and stew. The silence between them grew softer, no longer empty but carrying the weight of things unspoken. One evening, as snow fell soft outside, Margaret sat by the hearth darning a shirt. Morrison mended a bridle across the room, his hand sure, his face unreadable. The lamplight played across his features, showing lines carved by years of solitude. At last he spoke. "You asked once why I live alone. Maybe you deserve an answer." He set down the leather, staring into the fire. "My wife, Sarah, and our little boy, fever took them both 2 winters ago. By the time I rode for the doctor, it was already too late." His voice cracked, low and steady, like an old wound reopened. "Since then, this ranch has been nothing but work and silence. That's how I wanted it, or thought I did." Margaret listened, heart tightening. She knew that silence had lived in it herself since Thomas's death. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something raw, an ache that matched her own. "You don't need to be. You've lost too. You know what it does." The fire crackled between them, but neither moved closer. It was as if the storm outside still lingered in their hearts, holding them apart. Days blurred into weeks. Together they braved the cold, breaking ice, hauling feed, repairing fences torn by winter's fury. Margaret's body toughened, her spirit steadied. With each task, Morrison let her prove herself, never shielding her from the work. She earned her place beside him, step by step, scar by scar. But in the town of Bitter Creek, rumors spread like wildfire. Coulter's men whispered in saloons, painting her as shameless, a woman clinging to another man's hearth. Margaret heard of it when she ventured to town for supplies, eyes turning cold, voices hushed as she passed. One day, returning with flour and seed, she stopped by the tiny churchyard where Thomas lay. Snow covered his stone, simple and small. She knelt, fingers tracing the letters. "I don't know what to do," she murmured. "They'll never forgive me for surviving without you, but Thomas, I am surviving." The words hurt, but they were true. Rising, she looked west toward the ranch. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and strong. That was where her heart pulled now. That evening, Morrison found her staring long at the fire. "You've been quiet," he said. "I saw Thomas today," she whispered. At his grave, Morrison's face softened, grief etched into every line. "Do you think he'd want you to stop living?" Her throat closed. She had no answer. Yet the silence between them felt like one. Late January brought another storm, swift and merciless. Winds screamed against the cabin, rattling windows as if they would shatter. Snow piled high, sealing doors, cutting them off from the world. Morrison pulled her into the main house for safety. By lamplight they sat near the fire, mending torn clothes, patching harnesses, their shadows swaying across the walls. Outside the blizzard howled, but inside there was a strange calm. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "The night Sarah died, I swore I'd never open my heart again. It was easier to live with ghosts than risk another grave." His hands stilled, eyes fixed on the flames. "But since you came, this place feels alive. I feel alive." Margaret's breath caught. She clutched the hem of her quilt, her heart torn between past and present. "I loved Thomas," she whispered. "Part of me always will, but when I'm here with you, it feels like I've stepped out of the grave too." The fire popped, sparks rising. Their eyes met, a silence heavier than words. For one heartbeat she thought he might reach for her, close the space that storms and fear had carved between them. But he only rose, placing another log on the fire. "Try to sleep," he said gruffly, though his voice trembled. That night Margaret lay awake, listening to the storm rage beyond the walls. Inside her, another storm churned, guilt, longing, fear, and hope, all colliding. She realized then that survival had given her more than life. It had given her the chance to choose again. When morning came, the world outside lay buried in white, but within her something had shifted beyond return. Days later, trouble returned. The hoofbeats came at midnight, echoing across the valley. Men's voices again, rough with drink, with vengeance. Torches flared against the snow, their flames dancing like the devils of hell. Daniel shouted from the dark, his rage louder than the storm. "Come out, Morrison! Tonight we finish what we started!" Margaret's blood froze, but this time there was no hesitation, no thought of hiding. She rose, her hand steady as she took the shotgun once more. She had lived as a widow cast aside, she had walked into storms alone, and she had faced death in the snow. She would not bow now. As Morrison stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, Margaret joined him. Side by side they stood against the blaze of torches, against the jeers of men who mistook cruelty for strength. And in that moment she knew the true storm was not outside, but here, and she was ready to meet it. The night split open with firelight and fury. Daniels and his men pressed closer, their shouts carried on the freezing wind. Morrison's rifle gleamed in the torchlight, steady in his hands, though outnumbered 6-1. "Lay down the gun," Daniels sneered, his voice soaked in malice. "Or we burn it all, house, barn, cattle. You can watch it fall before we finish you." Margaret's pulse pounded, but fear no longer rooted her feet. She stepped forward, nightdress whipping in the wind, shotgun raised. "Not one torch touches this land," she declared. Her voice rang sharp, stronger than she felt, echoing across the yard. The men laughed, ugly and jeering. But when she fired into the air, the blast shattered their bravado. Horses reared, torches wavered. "The next shot goes into flesh," she warned, her eyes blazing. "Test me, and you'll see." For a moment, hesitation cracked their courage. But Daniels, reckless with drink and pride, urged his horse nearer. "A widow with a gun," he spat. "You'll never." Hooves thundered down the ridge, cutting him short. Marshal Samuel Hayes and 2 deputies charged into the yard, rifles leveled. Hayes's voice carried like judgment. "Evening, gentlemen. Looks to me like attempted murder and arson. Unless you fancy a noose, I'd suggest you scatter." The outlaws' bravado dissolved. One by one they mounted, cursing under their breath. Daniels lingered, his glare fixed on Morrison and Margaret. "This ain't finished," he snarled, spitting blood into the snow. "Yes, it is," Hayes answered coldly. "Because if harm comes to this ranch, I'll know exactly whose door to knock." At last the men retreated, their torches extinguished by the night. Silence fell heavy over the ranch, broken only by the wind. Margaret lowered her shotgun, arms trembling. The adrenaline drained from her body, leaving her weak, but her spirit blazed with a new fire. Morrison turned to her, his face bloodied from the scuffle, his gray eyes burning with something deeper than gratitude. "You shouldn't have stood out here," he murmured. "I couldn't hide while they threatened what saved me," she replied fiercely. "Not the cabin, not you." For a moment, words failed him. He reached out, brushing her arm with rough gentleness. "What you did tonight, I'll never forget." The marshal tipped his hat. "You've got friends in this valley, Morrison, but enemies too. Keep your rifles clean." With that, he and his deputies rode off, leaving the ranch wrapped in uneasy quiet. Inside, by the fire's glow, Margaret finally let herself cry, not in grief, but in release. For the first time, her tears carried no shame. She was no longer the widow wandering roads in despair. She had stood her ground, and she had been heard. Winter clung stubbornly to the valley, but the night of fire and rifles had forged something unbreakable. Margaret no longer felt like a guest on the Circle M. She belonged, not by pity, but by courage. Each morning, she rose before dawn, stoked the stove, and brewed coffee strong enough to chase the cold. Morrison, quiet as always, left a steaming cup by her hand before heading out to the corrals. Their routine became a rhythm unspoken, steady, as if the ranch itself acknowledged her place. They worked side by side through the bitter months, mending fences buried in snow, chopping firewood, tending cattle against the freeze. Morrison did not shield her from hardship. He let her labor, let her prove her strength. With each task, Margaret felt herself rebuilt, bone, flesh, and will hardened by survival. Evenings found them at the hearth, sharing scraps of memory. She told him of Thomas's whistling, of the quilt her grandmother had sewn. He spoke of Sarah's laughter, of the child who had followed him through pastures, wooden horse in hand. Their griefs, once sharp as blades, dulled when spoken aloud. But beneath sorrow lay something else, an ember stirring. She caught it in the way Morrison lingered when handing her tools, in the warmth of his gaze when she set bread on the table. She felt it in her own chest, a faint tremor of hope she had thought buried forever. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Each trip into Bitter Creek, whispers followed. Coulter's venom had spread, twisting her name into shame. Women drew children aside as she passed. Men looked away with knowing smirks. She held her head high, but inside the weight pressed heavy. One Sunday she stood again at Thomas's grave, snow melting into rivulets around the stone. "I swore I'd carry you always," she whispered. "But am I betraying you by wanting life again?" Her hands trembled against the letters, but the silence of the grave gave no answer. When she returned, Morrison was waiting by the fence, his coat dusted white. "Hard ride?" he asked gently. She nodded. Words hovered on her tongue, but she bit them back. He studied her face, reading what she could not speak. "The dead never ask us to stop living," he said at last. "They ask us to carry what mattered and to go on." The truth of it broke her resolve. Tears burned her eyes, but they were different this time. Not of despair, but of release. She let them fall, and Morrison, though silent, stood beside her until the last one dried. That night she realized the storms outside had lost their power. It was the storm within her heart that was finally breaking. By March, the valley began to thaw. Snow shrank into streams that glittered across the meadows, and blades of green pierced through the frost. The Circle M stirred with new life, calves bawling in the pastures, meadowlarks returning to the fence posts. Margaret felt the change within herself as keenly as she saw it in the land. The woman who had stumbled half dead into a storm was gone. In her place stood someone tested by fire and ice, someone who had found not only survival but strength. One morning, as she swept the foreman's cabin, Morrison knocked lightly at the door. In his hands he carried 2 tin cups of coffee, steam curling into the crisp air. He set one down, then lingered, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I gave you shelter till spring," he said slowly. "Spring's here." Margaret's heart tightened. She had known this moment would come, yet the thought of leaving hollowed her chest. She managed a nod, hiding her trembling hands in her apron. "Yes, you've given me more than I could ever repay." Morrison studied her, the silence stretching between them. Then, softly, he said, "I don't want you to go. Not as a guest, not as a helper, as my wife." The words hung in the air, heavier than the mountains, brighter than the thawing sky. Margaret's breath caught. In an instant she saw Thomas's smile, the grave where she had knelt, the road of loneliness she had walked. She carried all of it still, but she carried it into this moment. "Yes," she whispered, voice breaking. "Yes, I'll stay." They wed in the small church at Bitter Creek. Whispers rose like smoke, gossip clinging to her name, judgment sharp as knives, but Margaret no longer bowed beneath them. She walked the aisle with her head high, her heart steady. When Morrison took her hands, his vow was simple. "You saved me as much as I saved you." Her own vow rose to meet his. "Together we endure." That evening, they planted seeds in the thawing earth of the garden. Their hands, rough and scarred, pressed life into soil that had endured storms and still promised harvest. Side by side, they worked beneath the wide Wyoming sky. The Circle M had weathered blizzards, fire, and malice. Now it would know spring again. And Margaret Morrison, once a castaway widow with nowhere to go, had found not just shelter, but a home built on resilience, trust, and love. The story of Margaret Thornton, who became Margaret Morrison, was not just about a widow finding love again. It was about the endurance of the human spirit when stripped bare by grief, rejection, and storm. In the rawest hours of her life, Margaret had been cast out by family, abandoned by neighbors, and tempted by despair to surrender in the snow. Yet she kept walking, one step, then another, through wind that cut like knives, through whispers that slashed like blades. That stubborn march into the storm revealed something no letter, no gossip, no cruelty could erase her dignity. For dignity is not bestowed by others. It does not come from family name, dowry, or approval. It is forged in the furnace of hardship, hammered into shape by the choices we make when no one else will stand for us. Margaret claimed hers not by begging, not by yielding, but by standing straight when the world tried to bend her. And in Daniel Morrison she found not a savior, but a mirror. A man scarred by loss, carrying ghosts as heavy as her own. Together they discovered that grief does not vanish when love returns. It lingers, a shadow at the table, a silence in the night. But grief can also become the soil where new roots grow. By sharing their scars instead of hiding them, they planted a future neither could have built alone. The townsfolk whispered, they judged, as people always will. Yet their voices were powerless against the truth of a woman who stood with a shotgun in her hands, who dared to claim her right to survive with honor. Margaret's life became the proof that courage is not loud or reckless. Sometimes it is quiet, trembling, and still unyielding. And so the lesson remains, storms will come. They will strip us, test us, drive us to our knees. Some storms are blizzards of snow, others are whispers of slander, others still the silence of loss. But every storm carries within it the chance to decide, will we bow or will we rise? Margaret rose. She rose when she buried Thomas, when she shut the door on a home taken from her, when she faced the torchlight with fire in her own hands, and in rising, she found not just survival, but renewal. For in the wide and unforgiving West, as in life itself, dignity is the only shelter that cannot be stolen, and love, when chosen after loss, is the only spring that never ends.